She was tied to a chair in the basement of a house she'd visited 100 times before. The rope burned against her wrists as she struggled, her throat raw from screaming until her voice gave out. 22 years old, a college student with dreams of becoming a teacher. And in that moment, Jessica Matthews realized that the three men standing over her, the three men she'd called uncle her entire life, were about to destroy everything she thought she knew about family, about trust, about safety. The 911 call that came 3 hours later would uncover a web of secrets, manipulation, and violence that had been hiding in plain sight for years. How does a young woman end up betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect her? How does a family choose silence over justice, reputation over truth? This is not a story about strangers in dark alleys. This is about what happens when the monsters wear familiar faces, when they sit at your family dinner table, when they hug you at reunions and ask about your college classes while planning something unthinkable. What happened inside that house would uncover layers of family secrecy no one imagined, patterns of control and manipulation that extended back years, warning signs that were ignored because no one wanted to believe that people they loved could be capable of such evil. Before we continue, share this video to help raise awareness. Cases like Jessica's are more common than people think, and education saves lives. 1 in 3 cases of sexual assault involves a family member, yet we rarely talk about it because the truth is too uncomfortable, too painful, too close to home. Jessica Matthews grew up in a close-knit family in suburban Ohio, the kind of neighborhood where people knew each other's names and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. She was the middle child, with an older brother who'd enlisted in the military and a younger sister still in high school. From an early age, Jessica showed the kind of quiet determination that teachers notice. She wasn't the loudest in the room, but she was always the most prepared, always willing to help classmates who struggled with assignments. By the time she reached college, she'd earned a partial scholarship to study elementary education at a state university 2 hours from home. Her professors described her as thoughtful, creative, someone who genuinely cared about making a difference in children's lives. Her best friend from high school, Rachel, remembered Jessica as someone who lit up when talking about her future classroom, who collected children's books from thrift stores and kept detailed notes about teaching strategies she wanted to try. She was the friend who remembered birthdays, who showed up when you needed help moving, who listened without judgment when you needed to talk. She worked part-time at a local bookstore to help with expenses, often picking up extra shifts during holiday seasons. Her coworkers loved her reliability, her gentle humor, the way she could recommend the perfect book for any customer. Jessica's relationship with her extended family seemed normal, even warm. Her father had 3 younger brothers, Jeffrey, Anderson, and Andre, and they'd been fixtures in her life since childhood. Family gatherings always included them. Birthdays, holidays, summer barbecues, they were there. Jeffrey was the oldest, 42, divorced, with 2 teenage kids he saw occasionally. He worked in construction and had that rough, joking manner that some people found charming. Anderson, 39, had never married, lived alone in a small apartment across town, and worked as a warehouse supervisor. He was quieter than Jeffrey, more reserved, but Jessica remembered him always bringing her small gifts when she was little, stuffed animals, comic books. Andre, 37, was married with a young daughter. He managed a hardware store and seemed like the most stable of the 3 brothers, the one who'd figured out how to build a conventional life. Jessica never had reason to fear them. They were just her uncles, familiar faces at family events, men she'd known her entire life. She trusted them the way children trust the adults in their family, completely and without question. That trust, built over 22 years, would become the weapon they used against her. Looking back, Some family members would later admit they'd seen things that bothered them. The way Jeffrey drank too much at gatherings and became aggressive when challenged. The way Anderson seemed to have no close relationships outside the family, no friends anyone ever met. The way Andre could be controlling with his wife, demanding to know where she was, who she talked to. But families make excuses. They explain away behaviors that make them uncomfortable, because confronting the truth means admitting something terrible might be growing in their midst. Jessica's cousin Emily later said she'd felt uncomfortable around Jeffrey since she was a teenager, though she could never quite explain why. Something in the way he looked at her, the way he found reasons to touch her shoulder or hug her a little too long. She'd never said anything, but what could she say? He's my uncle and he makes me uncomfortable. Who would believe that? Who would want to believe that? Jeffrey Matthews was the kind of man who dominated any room he entered, not through charm, but through sheer force of personality. He spoke loudly, laughed loudly, and had opinions about everything. He'd been married twice, both marriages ending in divorce, and his relationships with his children were strained at best. His ex-wife had filed a restraining order during their divorce proceedings, claiming he'd grabbed her during arguments, though the order had eventually been dropped as part of their settlement. Friends from his construction crews described him as a hard worker, but someone with a temper, the kind of guy you didn't want to cross. At family gatherings, Jeffrey positioned himself as the fun uncle, the one who would sneak kids sips of beer when their parents weren't looking, who told inappropriate jokes and laughed when people objected. Some family members found him entertaining. Others found him exhausting, but no one called him dangerous. That would require acknowledging things they'd rather not see. His brother, Jessica's father, had defended Jeffrey more than once when other family members complained about his behavior. Boys will be boys, he'd say. Jeffrey's just rough around the edges. He means well. This instinct to protect, to excuse, to minimize would have devastating consequences. Anderson Matthews was Jeffrey's opposite in many ways. Where Jeffrey was loud, Anderson was quiet. Where Jeffrey sought attention, Anderson seemed to avoid it. He lived alone, worked the same warehouse job he'd had for 15 years, and rarely dated. Family members joked that he was married to his work, that he was too shy to meet women. The truth was more complicated. Anderson had learned early that being quiet, being helpful, being the one who didn't cause problems, gave him access and trust. He was the uncle who'd babysit when parents needed a break, who would offer rides to kids who needed to get somewhere, who would show up to school events when he wasn't expected. At the time, these seemed like the actions of a devoted uncle. Later, they would be recognized as grooming behaviors, carefully building trust and access.
Andre Matthews had built what appeared to be the most conventional life of the three brothers. He'd been married for 8 years, had a 6-year-old daughter, owned a house in a decent neighborhood. His wife, Patricia, worked as a nurse and seemed devoted to their family. To outsiders, they looked like they had it all figured out. But behind closed doors, Patricia was walking on eggshells. Andre monitored her phone, questioned her about conversations with coworkers, accused her of flirting when she was friendly to male customers at the grocery store. He controlled their finances, giving her an allowance despite her full-time job. Patricia had tried to leave twice but returned both times, partly because Andre promised to change, partly because she feared what he might do if she actually went through with it, partly because she worried about taking their daughter away from their father. She learned not to challenge him, not to question his decisions, not to object when he disappeared for hours without explanation. This pattern of control, of domination, of viewing others as objects to be managed rather than people with autonomy, extended beyond his marriage. It was who he was at his core. His coworkers at the hardware store knew him as demanding, quick to anger when things didn't go his way, but also charismatic enough that he'd been promoted to manager. The three brothers weren't particularly close to each other as adults. They had different lives, different friend groups, different daily routines. But they shared something beneath the surface, a sense of entitlement, a belief that they deserved what they wanted regardless of who got hurt. a willingness to prioritize their desires over other people's safety and dignity. They'd grown up in a household where their father ruled through intimidation, where their mother made excuses for bad behavior, where consequences were rare and accountability even rarer. They'd learned that if you were loud enough, charming enough, or quiet enough, you could get away with almost anything. And they'd been getting away with things, small things, boundary violations that family members overlooked for years. What they planned for Jessica was an escalation, but it wasn't a departure from who they'd always been. It was just the first time someone would fight back hard enough to make them face consequences. The Saturday started like any other weekend day. Jessica woke up in her small studio apartment near campus, made coffee, and settled into work on a lesson plan for her student teaching placement. She was 3 months away from graduation, already interviewing for positions at elementary schools in the area. The spring sunshine came through her window, and she remembered feeling grateful, thinking about how far she'd come, how close she was to achieving her dream of having her own classroom. Around 11 in the morning, her phone rang. It was Anderson. He said he'd been cleaning out his garage and found some old children's books he thought she might want for her future classroom. Did she want to come by and look through them? Jessica hesitated. She had plans to meet Rachel for dinner later, and she wanted to finish her lesson plan. But Anderson sounded eager to help, and free books were free books. Teachers, especially new teachers, learned to accept any resources offered. "Sure," she said. "I can stop by for a bit this afternoon." Looking back, Jessica would remember a small feeling of unease. Nothing she could name, just a subtle sense that something felt off about the invitation. Anderson had never offered her books before. He'd never been particularly interested in her teaching career. But she dismissed the feeling. He was her uncle. She'd known him her whole life. What reason did she have to be suspicious? This is one of the cruelest aspects of family-based violence, the way perpetrators weaponize the very trust that families are supposed to build. Jessica had been taught her whole life to trust her uncles, to accept their help, to be grateful for their attention. Those lessons, meant to build family bonds, became the trap. She finished her lesson plan, changed into jeans and a comfortable sweater, and texted Rachel to confirm their dinner plans for 6 o'clock. She drove to Anderson's apartment, a 20-minute trip through familiar streets. She'd been there before, not often, but a few times over the years. It was a ground-floor unit in an older complex, neat but spare, the home of someone who didn't care much about decoration or comfort. Anderson greeted her at the door, seemed friendly and normal. "The books were in the garage," he said. "Come on through." The garage was attached to the apartment, accessible through the kitchen. As she walked through, she noticed Jeffrey's truck in the driveway. That's when the first real spike of fear hit her. Why was Jeffrey here? Anderson saw her notice and said casually that Jeffrey had helped him move some boxes, was just about to leave. But Jeffrey was standing in the garage, and so was Andre. 3 uncles, all together in a place where Jessica had expected to find just one. Her heart started racing. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to make an excuse, to get out. But she'd been raised to be polite, to not make scenes, to trust family. She hesitated, and in that hesitation, they moved. Jeffrey blocked the door back to the apartment. Andre stepped behind her. Anderson's friendly expression disappeared, replaced with something cold and calculating. Jessica tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but her voice came out small and scared. She tried to move toward the door, and Jeffrey grabbed her arm, his grip brutal enough to leave bruises that would last for weeks. She screamed, and Andre clamped a hand over her mouth. They were strong, practiced, coordinated in a way that suggested this wasn't spontaneous. They'd planned this. They'd discussed it. They'd agreed on it. 3 men, family members, people she'd trusted her entire life, had conspired together to trap her. The next hours would be the worst of Jessica's life, a nightmare she'd spend years trying to process in therapy, trying to understand not just what happened, but how the people she trusted most could do this to her. They dragged her into the basement area of the apartment. They tied her to a chair with rope that Andre had ready, pre-cut links that proved this was premeditated. They told her to be quiet, that nobody would believe her if she told, that she'd ruin the family if she made a big deal out of this. The psychology of it was as devastating as the physical assault. They were telling her that her pain mattered less than family reputation, that she was responsible for their choices, that speaking the truth would make her the villain. Jessica fought. She fought harder than she'd ever fought for anything in her life. She screamed until her voice gave out. She struggled against the ropes until her wrists bled. She begged them to stop, reminded them that they were her niece, that they'd known her since she was born. Nothing reached them. Whatever humanity they might have once possessed had been abandoned in favor of their desires, their sense of entitlement, their belief that they had the right to take whatever they wanted. The assault lasted hours. All three participated. All three violated her in ways that would leave psychological scars far deeper than the physical injuries. And all three assumed they'd get away with it, just like they'd gotten away with smaller violations their whole lives. Before we continue deeper into Jessica's story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. These stories matter because they happen everywhere, in every community, to people who never imagined they'd become survivors. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We tell these stories not to sensationalize trauma, but to educate, to raise awareness, to break the silence that allows abuse to continue. Every person who learns to recognize warning signs, who believes survivors, who refuses to prioritize reputation over safety, makes it harder for predators to operate. Your attention, your willingness to engage with these difficult truths, is part of the solution. What happened in that basement was a calculated act of violence by three men who chose to prioritize their desires over Jessica's humanity, her safety, and her bodily autonomy. The details of the assault itself are not necessary to understand the gravity of what occurred. What matters is this: Jessica was isolated, restrained, and violated by three family members acting in coordination. They used physical force to overwhelm her. They used psychological manipulation to try to ensure her silence. They used their positions as trusted family members to gain access and opportunity. This was not a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment. This was planned, deliberate, predatory behavior. The assault left Jessica with physical injuries that would be documented later by medical professionals. Bruises on her wrists and arms from the restraints, other injuries consistent with forcible sexual assaults. But the deeper wounds were psychological. Jessica had trusted these men. She'd sat next to them at Thanksgiving dinners, she'd hugged them at family gatherings, she'd accepted their graduation gifts and their birthday wishes. And they'd been capable of this all along, willing to destroy her for their own gratification. During the assault, they made statements that revealed their mindset. Jeffrey told her this was her fault for being too friendly, for smiling too much, as if her basic kindness was an invitation to violence. Anderson said nobody would believe her if she told, that she'd be the one who tore the family apart. Andre was quieter but no less complicit, participating fully while saying nothing, as if his silence absolved him of responsibility. These statements show the distorted thinking that allows people to commit such acts. They'd convinced themselves that they were entitled to this, that Jessica somehow deserved it, that the consequences of speaking up would be her fault rather than theirs. Jessica survived. That's the most important thing to understand. She survived because she's stronger than they gave her credit for, because some part of her refused to let them win, because she held onto the knowledge that what they were doing was wrong, even as they tried to convince her otherwise. When they finally untied her after hours of assault, Jessica was in shock. Her body was shaking. Her mind couldn't process what had happened. Jeffrey told her to clean herself up and go home, to forget this ever happened, to move on with her life. As if that were possible, as if a person could simply forget being violated by family members, as if trauma worked that way. They let her go because they genuinely believed she wouldn't tell. They'd convinced themselves that family loyalty, shame, and fear would keep her silent. They'd seen it work before, in smaller ways, when family members overlooked their bad behavior, when women in the family made excuses for them, when children were told not to make trouble. They assumed Jessica would follow that same pattern, would prioritize family peace over her own justice. They were wrong. Jessica doesn't remember driving home. She has fractured memories of being in her car, of seeing streetlights pass by, of somehow making it back to her apartment. Trauma does that, fractures memory, protects the mind from processing more than it can handle in the moment. What she does remember is sitting on the floor of her bathroom, still fully dressed, unable to move, unable to think clearly, unable to do anything but shake. Hours passed. The sun set. Her phone rang multiple times, Rachel calling about their dinner plans, but Jessica couldn't make herself answer. It wasn't until nearly midnight that Jessica was finally able to reach for her phone. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it. She didn't call her parents. Some instinct told her they wouldn't believe her, or worse, that they'd believe her but choose the brothers anyway. She didn't call Rachel, couldn't bear the thought of saying the words out loud yet. She called 911. The recording of that call would later be played in court, and even seasoned detectives said it was one of the most heartbreaking things they'd ever heard. Jessica's voice was barely above a whisper, broken and hoarse from screaming hours earlier. She told the dispatchers she'd been assaulted. She gave her uncle's names. She described, in fragments and pauses, what they'd done. The dispatcher, trained to handle crisis calls, kept her on the line, kept her talking, told her help was coming. Within minutes, police officers arrived at Jessica's apartment. They found her still sitting on the bathroom floor, still in the same clothes, visibly injured and deeply traumatized. The responding officers were from the local police department's Special Victims Unit, officers with specialized training in handling sexual assault cases. Officer Sarah Chen was the first to speak with Jessica. She'd been a special victims detective for 7 years, had seen hundreds of cases, but she later said Jessica's case affected her in ways that stayed with her. Jessica was so young, so clearly devastated, and the fact that family members had done this made it even more painful. Officer Chen sat on the floor with Jessica, didn't rush her, let her tell the story at her own pace. She explained that Jessica needed to go to the hospital, that they needed to document her injuries, collect evidence, do a full medical examination. Jessica nodded but couldn't seem to make herself stand up. Eventually, with gentle encouragement, Jessica agreed to go to the hospital. Officer Chen drove her herself rather than putting her in a patrol car, a small kindness that Jessica would later say meant everything in that moment. At the hospital's emergency department, Jessica was taken to a private examination room. A specially trained sexual assault nurse examiner, or SANE nurse, conducted a comprehensive forensic examination. They photographed Jessica's injuries, the bruises on her wrists, and other physical evidence of assaults. They collected DNA samples. They documented everything with meticulous care, knowing this evidence might be crucial for prosecution. The examination took hours. Each part of it required Jessica to relive the trauma, to allow strangers to examine her most intimate injuries, to describe in clinical detail what had been done to her. It was necessary, but that didn't make it less painful. Through it all, Officer Chen stayed nearby, offering support, explaining each step, reminding Jessica that she was safe now, that she was doing the right thing by reporting. By the time the examination was finished, it was nearly 4 a.m. Jessica was exhausted, traumatized, and terrified about what would happen next. Officer Chen asked if there was someone Jessica wanted to call, someone who could stay with her. Jessica called Rachel. She didn't explain everything over the phone, just asked if she could come over, said she needed help. Rachel arrived within 20 minutes, took one look at Jessica's face, at the way she was holding herself, at the haunted expression in her eyes, and knew something terrible had happened. She wrapped Jessica in a hug and didn't ask questions, just promised she was there, she wasn't going anywhere, they'd figure this out together. That night, Rachel stayed with Jessica, sleeping on the floor beside her bed because Jessica couldn't bear to be alone. The assault had happened, but Jessica's fight for justice was just beginning.
Sunday morning, less than 12 hours after the assault, Detective Marcus Johnson was assigned to Jessica's case. He'd been with the Special Victims Unit for 9 years, had handled hundreds of sexual assault investigations, but cases involving multiple family members were relatively rare. The initial evidence was strong. Jessica's medical examination had documented clear injuries consistent with her account. DNA evidence had been collected. She'd made a timely report and provided detailed, consistent statements. But Detective Johnson knew that family assault cases presented unique challenges. Families often closed ranks to protect their own, even when their own were perpetrators. His first step was to conduct a formal interview with Jessica. She came to the police station that afternoon, with Rachel beside her for support. The interview room was designed to be as non-threatening as possible. Comfortable chairs, soft lighting, nothing that felt like the interrogation rooms seen on television shows. Detective Johnson explained the process, what would happen next, how the investigation would proceed. He asked Jessica to tell him everything she remembered about the assault, and she did, speaking slowly, sometimes stopping to cry, sometimes having to take breaks, but getting through it. Her account was detailed and consistent. She described the phone call from Anderson, the invitation to look at books, her arrival at his apartment, the presence of all three uncles, the assault itself, their statements to her, her eventual escape. Detective Johnson took careful notes, asked clarifying questions when needed, but mostly let Jessica tell her story in her own words. He believed her. That might seem obvious, that a detective investigating an assault would believe the victim, but sadly it's not always the case. Many survivors face skepticism, victim-blaming questions, investigators who seem more interested in poking holes in their stories than in finding the truth. Detective Johnson wasn't like that. The next step was to secure the crime scene before the suspects could destroy evidence. Detective Johnson obtained a search warrant for Anderson's apartment, specifically for the garage and basement areas where Jessica said the assault occurred. Officers executed the warrant that same evening, while Anderson was at work. They found the chair Jessica had been tied to, still in the basement. They found the rope, cut into lengths exactly as Jessica had described. They found physical evidence in the basement area that would later be tested and matched to the DNA evidence collected during Jessica's medical examination. They photographed everything, collected everything, documented the layout of the apartment in a way that corroborated Jessica's description. While the search was being conducted, other detectives began interviewing potential witnesses. They spoke with Jessica's neighbors at her apartment, confirming that she'd arrived home late Saturday afternoon, visibly distressed. They spoke with the 911 dispatcher who'd taken Jessica's call, documenting the timeline. They began building a comprehensive timeline of events that would prove crucial for prosecution. They also started looking into the backgrounds of the three suspects. What they found was revealing. Jeffrey had a prior arrest for domestic violence during his second divorce, though charges had been dropped when his ex-wife declined to testify. Anderson had no criminal record, but detectives discovered he'd been asked to leave a volunteer position at a youth sports league several years earlier after parents complained about his behavior, though nothing formal had been reported. Andre also had no criminal record, but when detectives spoke with his wife Patricia, they uncovered a pattern of controlling and abusive behavior. Patricia was terrified when police showed up at her door. She initially claimed everything was fine, that Andre was a good husband and father. But Detective Johnson recognized the signs of someone living in fear. He gave Patricia his card, told her she could call anytime, day or night, if she needed help. That conversation planted a seed that would later prove important. The investigation also uncovered communication between the three brothers leading up to the assault. Phone records showed multiple calls between them in the days before Saturday. While the content of those calls couldn't be recovered, the pattern suggested coordination and planning. By Monday morning, less than 48 hours after the assault, Detective Johnson had enough evidence to make arrests. He coordinated with the district attorney's office to file charges. All three brothers were charged with first-degree sexual assault, kidnapping, and conspiracy. The charges carried potential sentences of decades in prison. Now came the hard part, actually arresting the suspects and dealing with the family fallout that would inevitably follow. The arrests happened on Monday afternoon. Officers went to each brother's workplace to take them into custody. Jeffrey was arrested at his construction site, placed in handcuffs in front of his coworkers. Anderson was arrested at the warehouse, let out in cuffs while his colleagues watched in shock. Andre was arrested at the hardware store where he was a manager, his employees stunned to see him treated like a criminal. All three were processed at the county jail, photographed, fingerprinted, and read their rights. All three requested lawyers and refused to make statements. But there was a twist no one saw coming. 2 days after the arrests, Andre's wife Patricia called Detective Johnson. She said she needed to talk to him, that she had information about the case. When she came to the police station, she was shaking, terrified, but determined. She told Detective Johnson that this wasn't the first time. She said that years ago, when she was engaged to Andre, but before they were married, she'd overheard a disturbing conversation between the three brothers at a family gathering. They'd been drinking, thought no one could hear them, and they were talking about Jessica. This was when Jessica was still in high school. They were talking about her in sexual terms, making comments about her appearance, speculating about her sexual experience.
Patricia had been horrified, but told herself it was just drunk talk, inappropriate but not dangerous. Now, she realized it was more than that. They'd been grooming, planning, fantasizing about this for years. The assault on Jessica wasn't a sudden decision. It was the culmination of years of predatory thinking. Patricia also revealed something else. She said she'd seen text messages on Andre's phone a few months ago, messages between him and his brothers where they were coordinating times to see Jessica, comparing notes on her schedule, her routines. She hadn't understood what it meant at the time, had convinced herself it was innocent, but now she knew better. This revelation changed everything. It transformed the case from a terrible crime of opportunity to evidence of long-term predatory conspiracy. It showed premeditation, planning, a shared mindset among the three brothers. And it raised a horrifying question. Had there been other victims, other young women in the family who'd been targeted but never reported? If you believe more people need to understand how hidden abuse can happen inside families, hit the like button. It helps push this awareness to others who might need it. Cases like Jessica's are more common than we want to believe, and the more people understand the patterns of familial abuse, the better we can protect potential victims and support survivors. With Patricia's information, Detective Johnson expanded the investigation. He began reaching out to other women in the family, particularly Jessica's cousins and the ex-wives of the brothers. What he discovered was a pattern of behavior that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Emily, Jessica's cousin, who'd felt uncomfortable around Jeffrey, finally found someone who took her concerns seriously.
She told Detective Johnson that when she was 16, Jeffrey had cornered her at a family party, tried to kiss her, told her she was beautiful and he could show her things. She'd pushed him away and run, never told anyone because she thought no one would believe her, thought she'd be accused of making trouble. Another cousin, Michelle, revealed that Anderson had offered to give her rides home from school when she was 14. During one of these rides, he'd driven to a secluded area and tried to touch her. She'd managed to jump out of the car and walk home. She'd told her mother, who'd confronted Anderson, but he'd claimed it was a misunderstanding. The mother had chosen to believe him, told Michelle to stay away from him, but didn't report it to police or tell other family members. Jeffrey's ex-wife, the one who'd filed the restraining order, agreed to speak with Detective Johnson off the record. She said Jeffrey had been sexually aggressive throughout their marriage, demanding things she wasn't comfortable with, becoming violent when she refused. She tried to talk to other family members about his behavior, but they'd told her all marriages have problems, that she needed to work it out. The pattern was clear. These men had been engaging in predatory behavior for years, targeting vulnerable women and girls in their family, relying on family loyalty and the instinct to avoid scandal to protect them. Each incident by itself might have seemed isolated, explainable. Together, they painted a picture of serial predators who learned they could operate with impunity as long as they stayed within the family. Detective Johnson documented all of these accounts, though not all of the women were willing to make formal statements or testify. The fear of family backlash, the shame they'd been taught to feel, the years of being told to keep quiet were hard to overcome. The forensic evidence from the assault itself was being processed. The rope used to restrain Jessica had clear fingerprints from all three brothers. DNA evidence from the basement matched genetic material collected during Jessica's medical examination, definitively linking Jeffrey and Andre to the assault. Anderson's DNA was found on the rope and on Jessica's clothing. The medical examiner's report confirmed injuries consistent with Jessica's account of forcible sexual assault and restraint. Phone records showed the brothers had been in contact multiple times in the week leading up to the assault, with the frequency of calls increasing on Friday and Saturday morning. Technology experts examining Anderson's home computer found a troubling search history from weeks before the assault. Searches about drug interactions and sedation, about soundproofing, about how long DNA evidence remained viable. This suggested even more extensive planning than originally thought. They'd researched how to commit the crime and potentially get away with it. They just underestimated Jessica's courage in reporting. The district attorney's office was building a strong case, but they knew the defense would argue that this was consensual, that Jessica had changed her mind afterward, that family members wouldn't do something this horrible to each other. Every sexual assault case faces skepticism, but cases involving family members often face even more doubt because people don't want to believe that relatives could be capable of such violence. The community was starting to learn about the case. Jessica's family name had been kept out of media reports to protect her privacy, but the suspects' names were public record after their arrests. Their co-workers, neighbors, and acquaintances were shocked. They seemed like normal guys, people said. They came to work, paid their bills, attended family events. How could they have done something like this? This reaction, while understandable, reflects a dangerous misconception. Predators don't look like monsters. They look like everyone else. They hold jobs, maintain relationships, present normal facades to the world. That's how they operate for so long without detection. The arrest of the three brothers tore Jessica's family apart in ways that would never fully heal. Within days of the arrests becoming public, battle lines were drawn. Some family members believed Jessica immediately, rallied around her, offered support. Others refused to believe the accusations, convinced there must be some mistake or misunderstanding. And others took a middle ground that was almost worse, saying they believed something happened, but Jessica must be exaggerating, must have misunderstood, must bear some responsibility. Jessica's father faced an impossible situation. 3 of the accused were his brothers. The victim was his daughter. He wanted to believe his daughter, but accepting the truth meant acknowledging that his brothers, men he'd grown up with, defended, made excuses for over the years, were capable of something monstrous. For the first week, he barely spoke. He withdrew into himself, unable to process the competing loyalties. Jessica's mother had no such conflict. She believed her daughter from the first moment, moved into Jessica's apartment to care for her, and made it clear she wanted nothing to do with the brothers ever again. The conflict between Jessica's parents became intense. Her mother demanded that her father choose, daughter or brothers, because there was no middle ground here. Her father struggled, wavered, tried to find some way to support everyone. Finally, nearly 2 weeks after the assault, he made his choice. He went to Jessica's apartment, sat with her, and told her he believed her. He said he was sorry for taking so long to say it, sorry for all the years he'd made excuses for his brother's bad behavior, sorry for not protecting her better. He said he was cutting off contact with his brothers, would testify for the prosecution if needed, would support Jessica through the trial no matter what it cost him. Not all family members made the same choice. Jessica's paternal grandmother refused to believe the accusations. She'd raised those boys, she said. They weren't perfect, but they weren't rapists. She accused Jessica of lying to get attention, of trying to destroy the family. She called her mother and screamed at her for supporting these lies. She hired a lawyer and tried to visit her sons in jail, posted bail for Jeffrey when it was set. 2 of Jessica's aunts sided with the grandmother, claiming Jessica must have led the brothers on somehow, must have been drinking or on drugs, must have consented and then regretted it. The victim blaming was relentless and devastating. Other relatives tried to stay neutral, saying they loved everyone and didn't want to take sides. But neutrality in cases of assault is inherently taking the side of the perpetrator. Saying you don't want to take sides when someone has been violated is saying that maintaining family peace matters more than supporting a victim. Jessica felt this betrayal almost as deeply as the assault itself. These were people who'd held her as a baby, celebrated her birthdays, cheered at her graduation. Now they were asking her to understand why they couldn't fully support her, why they needed to maintain relationships with their rapists, because family is complicated. The family gatherings that had been a fixture of Jessica's life stopped entirely. Thanksgiving was 3 months after the assault, and the family didn't gather. Christmas came and went without the traditional celebration. Cousins who'd grown up together stopped speaking. Siblings of the accused brothers stopped talking to each other. The family tree that had seemed so solid, so permanent, fractured into pieces that would never fit back together the same way. Jessica's younger sister, who was still in high school, faced bullying from classmates who'd heard about the case. Kids can be cruel, and some of them repeated the victim-blaming narratives they'd heard from adults.
Jessica's sister got into fights defending Jessica's name, was suspended from school, eventually had to transfer to a different district to escape the harassment.
Jessica's brother, serving in the military overseas, requested emergency leave to come home and support his sister. When he arrived and learned the full extent of what had happened, he had to be physically restrained from going to the jail where his uncles were being held. His rage was understandable, but couldn't be acted upon. He channeled it instead into being present for Jessica, attending every court hearing, making sure she knew at least one male family member stood with her completely and without reservation. The emotional toll on everyone who supported Jessica was immense. They faced harassment from family members who sided with the accused. They received angry phone calls, accusatory messages, threats to cut them out of wills and family businesses. Supporting Jessica required courage because it came with real social and economic costs. Long-standing family secrets began emerging in the chaos. An older aunt finally admitted that the brother's father, Jessica's grandfather, who died years earlier, had been abusive to his wife and children. He'd ruled the household through fear and intimidation, had normalized violence and control. The brothers had grown up watching their father dominate their mother, had learned that might makes right, that women exist to serve men's needs. The cycle of abuse had been perpetuating for generations, but no one had talked about it. Keeping family secrets, protecting the family name, these values had been prioritized over safety and healing. Now, forced to confront the ultimate result of that silence, some family members began questioning everything they'd accepted as normal. Patricia, Andre's wife, filed for divorce within a month of his arrest. She'd finally found the courage to leave, partly because his incarceration made it safer, partly because Detective Johnson had connected her with domestic violence resources and counseling. She testified about the controlling behavior she'd endured, the fear she'd lived with, the warning signs she'd seen but been too afraid to report. Her testimony would prove crucial in establishing Andre's character and pattern of behavior. She also got full custody of their daughter, with Andre's parental rights being evaluated by family court. The daughter was only 6 years old, too young to fully understand why Daddy was gone, but old enough to sense the fear and relief in her mother's voice when she talked about the future. The legal process moved forward with unusual speed, partly because the evidence was so strong, partly because the district attorney's office recognized the importance of bringing this case to trial while the evidence was fresh. All three brothers initially pleaded not guilty. Their defense attorneys filed motions to suppress evidence, to sever the trials, so each brother would be tried separately, to exclude certain testimony. Most of these motions were denied. The judge assigned to the case was a veteran of the bench with a reputation for fairness, but also for not tolerating legal games designed to traumatize victims. Jessica had to give a deposition, sitting in a room with defense attorneys who tried to discredit her story. They asked invasive questions about her sexual history, her drinking habits, her clothing choices, all designed to imply she'd somehow invited or deserved the assault. Jessica's attorney objected to many questions, but some had to be answered. Jessica held firm. She told the truth clearly and consistently, refused to be shaken, called out victim blaming when she saw it. The defense attorneys had hoped to rattle her, to find inconsistencies they could exploit at trial. Instead, they discovered that Jessica was a strong, credible witness who would be difficult to break on the stand. Faced with the strength of the prosecution's case, Jeffrey's attorney approached the district attorney with a plea deal offer. Jeffrey would plead guilty to reduce charges and testify against his brothers in exchange for a lighter sentence. The prosecution rejected the offer. They had enough evidence to convict all three without needing anyone to turn on the others, and they weren't interested in giving any of these men a break. The message was clear. If you commit a crime this calculated and violent, you face the full consequences. As the trial date approached, Anderson's resolve broke. 6 months after his arrest, he pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for the prosecution agreeing not to seek the maximum sentence. He'd still face decades in prison, but he'd avoid the possibility of life without parole. His guilty plea included a full allocution, meaning he had to stand in court and describe what he'd done. He admitted to planning the assault with his brothers. He admitted to calling Jessica with a false pretense about books. He admitted to restraining her. He admitted to the assault itself. His voice was flat and emotionless as he spoke, showing no real remorse, just resignation to the consequences he could no longer avoid. Jessica attended the hearing where Anderson pleaded guilty. She wanted to see him admit what he'd done. When he spoke the words, when he described the assault in clinical terms required by the court, Jessica felt something shift inside her. It wasn't healing, that would take much longer, but it was validation. He'd admitted it. On the record, in a court of law, he'd confirmed that she'd been telling the truth all along. Everyone who doubted her, who accused her of lying or exaggerating, had to confront the fact that the perpetrator himself said she was right. Jeffrey and Andre proceeded to trial. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, medical testimony, the detailed timeline of events, phone records showing coordination, Patricia's testimony about the warning signs, statements from other women who'd been targeted by these men over the years. They presented the recording of Jessica's 911 call, and several jurors were visibly emotional listening to her broken voice describing what had been done to her. The defense tried to argue that the sexual contact was consensual, that she had regretted it afterward and made false accusations out of shame or revenge. The defense called character witnesses who testified that Jeffrey and Andre were good men, hardworking, dedicated family members. Then Jessica testified. She took the stand and spent 2 full days telling her story. The prosecution led her through a careful, detailed account of the assault. She described the phone call, the trap, the basement, everything that happened. She cried several times, but never wavered. When the defense cross-examined her, they tried every tactic to discredit her testimony. They asked why she'd gone to Anderson's apartment if she felt unsafe. She explained that she had no reason to feel unsafe until she saw all 3 uncles there. They asked why she hadn't fought harder. She looked the defense attorney in the eye and said she'd fought as hard as anyone could against 3 grown men. They asked why she had waited hours to call 911. She explained that trauma doesn't follow a convenient timeline, that she was in shock, that she'd called as soon as she was capable of doing so. The defense couldn't break her. Jessica's testimony was clear, consistent, and backed up by overwhelming physical evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. They found Jeffrey and Andre guilty on all counts: first-degree sexual assault, kidnapping, conspiracy. When the verdicts were read, Jeffrey showed no emotion. Andre put his hands in his head. Jessica, sitting in the gallery with her mother and brother on either side of her, felt tears streaming down her face. Not tears of joy, exactly, but tears of relief, of validation, of finally being believed in the most official way possible.
Sentencing came 2 months later. Anderson, who'd pleaded guilty, was sentenced to 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 15 years. Jeffrey, who'd been identified as the primary organizer of the assault, was sentenced to 40 years with no parole for 30 years. Andre received 35 years with no parole for 25 years. All 3 would be required to register as sex offenders for life if they were ever released. The judge, before announcing the sentences, addressed the defendants directly. She said their crimes were particularly heinous because they'd violated not just Jessica's body, but the sacred trust of family. She said they demonstrated no genuine remorse, only regret at being caught. She said the sentences reflected the severity of what they'd done and society's need to protect potential future victims from them. Jessica was given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement before sentencing. She stood at the podium, looked directly at her uncles, and spoke for 15 minutes. She told them they'd taken something from her she could never get back: her sense of safety, her ability to trust easily, her relationship with extended family. She told them she'd spent 6 months in intensive therapy learning how to sleep through the night again, how to not panic when men stood too close to her, how to believe she had value beyond what had been done to her. She told them she forgave them, not for their benefit, but for her own peace, because carrying hatred was too heavy a burden. But she also told them she hoped they spent every day of their prison sentences thinking about what they'd done, truly reflecting on how they'd become the kind of men who could commit such violence. When Jessica finished speaking, the courtroom was silent, except for the sound of people crying. The judge thanked her for her courage, both in reporting and in testifying. The defense attorneys had no response. The brothers were led out of the courtroom in handcuffs to begin their sentences. Jessica walked out surrounded by the family members who'd supported her, ready to begin the next phase of her healing. Recovery from sexual assault is not a linear process. It's not something you do once and then move on from. It's ongoing work that requires courage, support, and time. Jessica started therapy within a week of the assault, working with a counselor who specialized in trauma and sexual violence. In the beginning, she could barely speak about what happened without having panic attacks. She had nightmares every night, sometimes multiple times a night, waking up screaming or crying. She couldn't be alone in rooms with men, even men she knew and trusted. She stopped going to her classes at the university, couldn't focus, couldn't be in crowds.
The therapist helped Jessica understand that these reactions were normal, that her brain and body were trying to protect her from further harm, that healing would take time but was possible. They worked on grounding techniques for when Jessica felt overwhelmed, ways to remind herself that she was safe in the present moment, even when her mind was trapped in memories of the assault. They processed the trauma bit by bit at a pace Jessica could handle, never pushing her further than she was ready to go. Slowly, over months, Jessica began to reclaim pieces of her life. She started sleeping for longer periods. The nightmares became less frequent. She could leave her apartment without feeling like everyone was staring at her. Rachel remained Jessica's constant support, along with her mother and brother. They created a network of safety around her, making sure she was never alone when she didn't want to be, respecting when she needed space, celebrating every small victory in her recovery. Jessica's younger sister also became unexpectedly important to her healing. The sister, who was 16 and dealing with her own trauma from the family fallout and school bullying, would come over and just sit with Jessica, watching movies or doing homework in companionable silence. Sometimes the most healing presence is someone who doesn't need you to talk, who's just there. Jessica made the difficult decision to take a semester off from school. Her professors and advisors were supportive, arranging for medical leave that wouldn't affect her academic standing. She used that time to focus on therapy, on healing, on rebuilding her sense of self. She also found healing through helping others. She started volunteering with a local sexual assault support organization, first answering phones on their crisis hotline, later facilitating support groups for other survivors. Helping others process their trauma helped Jessica process her own. Hearing other stories of survival and recovery reminded her that she was not alone, that what happened to her was not her fault, that healing was possible. 8 months after the assault, Jessica made the decision to return to school. It was terrifying. She changed universities, transferring to a campus in a different city where no one knew her story unless she chose to share it. Starting over was difficult but also liberating. She could be more than a victim. She could be Jessica, the student teacher, Jessica, the future educator, Jessica who had interests and dreams beyond what had been done to her. She threw herself into her studies, channeling the intensity she'd been using to survive into academic achievement. She student taught at an elementary school and discovered that working with children was healing in its own way. Their innocence, their joy, their resilience reminded her why she'd wanted to teach in the first place. A year after the assault, Jessica graduated with her teaching degree. Her mother, father, brother, sister, and Rachel attended the ceremony. Some of her aunts and uncles who'd supported her were there too. It was a smaller celebration than it would have been if the family hadn't been fractured, but it was genuine and full of love. Jessica gave a speech at the graduation as one of the top students in her program. She didn't talk specifically about the assault, but she talked about overcoming adversity, about finding strength you didn't know you had, about the importance of people who stand by you in your darkest moments. Many people in the audience were crying by the time she finished.
Jessica got a job teaching third grade at an elementary school known for its trauma-informed approach to education. She was open with her principal about her history, wanting to make sure there would be support if she had difficult days. The principal assured her that the school valued her resilience and her passion for teaching. Jessica proved to be a gifted teacher, particularly skilled at creating safe, nurturing classroom environments where all students felt valued. Her own experience with trauma made her especially attuned to children who were struggling, who seemed withdrawn or scared, who might be experiencing abuse at home. She became an advocate within her school for trauma-informed teaching practices. 2 years after the assault, Jessica began speaking publicly about her experience. She partnered with organizations working to prevent sexual violence and support survivors. She spoke at high schools and colleges about consent, about recognizing warning signs of predatory behavior, about the particular dynamics of familial assault. She spoke at law enforcement trainings about how to interview assault victims with compassion and respect. She used her voice to educate, to raise awareness, to break the silence that had protected her abusers for so long. It was difficult to stand in front of strangers and say, "This happened to me," but Jessica found purpose in it. Every time someone approached her after a presentation to say they'd experienced something similar, or that they now understood dynamics they'd been confused about before, or that they felt empowered to speak up about abuse, Jessica knew the pain of sharing her story was worth it. Jessica also worked to forgive herself for things that weren't her fault. She'd spent months blaming herself for going to Anderson's apartment, for not recognizing the danger sooner, for not fighting harder. Therapy helped her understand that the only people responsible for the assault were the 3 men who committed it. She'd done nothing wrong. Going to her uncle's apartment wasn't wrong. Trusting family members wasn't wrong. The wrongness belonged entirely to the perpetrators, and Jessica worked to truly internalize that truth. Some days were still hard. Anniversaries of the assault, holidays that used to mean family gatherings, unexpected encounters with family members who'd sided against her, these things could trigger difficult emotions. But Jessica had built a toolkit of coping strategies, a network of support, and a life that was bigger than what had been done to her. She was a survivor, a teacher, a sister, a daughter, a friend, and an advocate. The assault was part of her story, but it didn't define her entire narrative. Jessica's story is heartbreaking, but it's also a testament to human resilience and the power of believing survivors. Think about what might have happened if Jessica hadn't reported. Her uncles would still be freed, potentially targeting other young women in the family. The cycle of abuse that had persisted for generations would have continued unchecked. But Jessica found the courage to speak up, to endure the investigation and trial, to face down family members who chose reputation over truth. Her courage changed everything. The 3 men who assaulted her will spend decades in prison, unable to hurt anyone else. Other women in the family who'd been victimized by these men finally felt safe enough to speak about their experiences. Patricia escaped an abusive marriage and built a safer life for herself and her daughter. But Jessica shouldn't have had to be that courageous. The systems that should have protected her, family members who should have recognized and reported warning signs, a culture that should have taught boys not to rape rather than teaching girls not to be raped, these systems failed long before the assault happened. We need to do better. We need to believe survivors when they speak up. We need to hold perpetrators accountable, even when they're family members, especially when they're family members. We need to recognize that most sexual assaults are committed by someone they know, often someone they trust, and we need to stop acting like family relationships immunize people from being predators. If you're watching this and you've experienced sexual assault, especially assault by a family member, please know that it's not your fault. Nothing you did, nothing you wore, nowhere you went, no relationship you had gives anyone the right to violate you. You deserve to be believed, supported, and protected. There are resources available. The National Sexual Assault Hotline is available 24 hours a day at 1-800-656-HOPE. Many communities have local sexual assault service providers who offer free counseling
counseling, advocacy, and support. You don't have to face this alone, and you don't have to stay silent to protect people who hurt you. If you're watching this and you know someone who's been assaulted, believe them. Don't question their story. Don't ask what they were wearing. Don't wonder why they didn't fight harder or report sooner. Just believe them and ask what they need. Sometimes that's help reporting to police. Sometimes it's just someone to sit with them. Sometimes it's practical support like rides to medical appointments or help paying for therapy. Your belief and support can be life-changing for a survivor. And if you're watching this and you recognize predatory patterns in your own behavior or thoughts, please get help before you hurt someone. There are treatment programs for people who are attracted to minors or who have violent sexual fantasies. Seeking help is hard, but causing irreparable harm to another person is worse.
You have a choice in how you act, regardless of what thoughts or urges you experience. Choose to get help. Choose to not become someone who destroys another person's sense of safety and self-worth. Jessica wanted her story shared not for sympathy, but for education. She wanted people to understand how familial assault happens, how perpetrators operate, how families can unknowingly enable abuse through silence and excuse-making. She wanted other survivors to know they're not alone, that healing is possible, that speaking up takes incredible courage, but can lead to justice. Her message to anyone watching is simple. Believe survivors, support them, hold perpetrators accountable, and never prioritize family reputation over someone's safety and dignity. If you believe Jessica's courage deserves to be heard, share this video, comment justice to support survivors worldwide, and subscribe for more real stories told for awareness and protection. These conversations are uncomfortable, but discomfort is a small price to pay if it means even one person recognizes warning signs in time, even one survivor feels empowered to report, even one perpetrator faces consequences instead of finding new victims. Thank you for watching, for listening, for caring enough to engage with difficult truths. Together, we can create a world where survivors are believed, where predators are held accountable, and where silence no longer protects those who cause harm.